Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Cameron English here with you, Director of Biosciences at the American Council on Science and Health. Very excited for this episode because we have a triple threat. We have all of our core staff here. And by all of our core staff, I mean Dr. Chuck Dinerstein, Dr. Josh Bloom, and myself. It's a very thrilling pay-per-view style event. How are you gentlemen this morning?
Great. Excellent. And slightly cooler than you.
Yeah, man. As I speak these words, it's like 111 degrees outside. Thanks to the fascinating physics of the Pacific Ocean. So it's the last day. We'll make it through, but it is unpleasant. Let's just put it that way. And Josh, how are you today, my friend?
I'm good. They took the straitjacket off for this. And it enables me to express myself.
Well, see, that's what happens when you take your medicine. You know, you get privileges, and that's what life's all about.
So let me ask you this real quick, Cameron. Is it much better that it's a dry heat?
After 100 degrees, it's just monopoly weather is what I call it. It doesn't really matter. It's just so awful that it could be dry. It could be humid. It just sucks. If you go outside for more than 5 minutes, what are you doing with your life? There's no point.
Gotcha.
Anyways, enough about my pleasant weather circumstances, everybody. We're going to cover 3 stories because the 3 of us are here this week. And you guys read all 3 of these stories in pretty significant numbers. So first up, we've got a story that Josh wrote. It's called Why Are Clouds Seeded with Silver and Does It Work? And then Chuck looked at some interesting research on the effects of sugar taxes, which are almost constantly in the news because either people hate them or they love them. So we've got some research to look at here. And then finally, I took a look at some of the research on the link between climate change and heart attacks, and we'll discuss why I think that is an absurdity in a few minutes. But Josh, first up, tell us about seeding clouds with silver. What the hell does that actually mean?
Well, it's no secret that there's a massive drought in a whole bunch of places in the world. And, California is certainly one of them, the Southwest. And it's, I saw a photo of, was it Lake Mead, the one that goes to Hoover Dam, or is it another one of the other lakes? Yeah.
That's one of them, yep.
And it's like a little puddle. I mean, I've been there a couple of times. It didn't look anything like that. There's some crazy stuff going on. So one of the places that they're having a bad drought is a couple of provinces in China. And they happen to be 2 of the most important rice-producing provinces. And they're having a nasty drought there. So the Chinese decided to try cloud seeding, which is an old method that sort of works or doesn't. It's no magic elixir, but under certain circumstances, you get a little rain out of it. I don't really want to go into how well it works, but just the chemistry of it is kind of interesting, and I'll try and keep that to a minimum. There's a process called nucleation where you provide, let's say, a catalyst, which is usually a tiny crystal, and it will then cause another substance to solidify on it, in this case, water in the form of ice. And then that becomes a seed crystal for other water that happens to be in the liquid form if the temperature is cold enough up in the clouds and the conditions are right. So I put a video on my piece about what it looks like using a seed crystal. And this is something we did constantly in organic chemistry because crystallization is by far the best way to purify an organic chemical. And in fact, I was so good at crystallizing things that people would run down the hall and go, I can't crystallize this. Can you help? And I go, yeah, I'm Billy Crystal. Give me that thing. And like about 2 seconds later, I'd pull a couple of tricks and then the crystals would form.
Did you just call yourself Billy Crystal?
I certainly did.
You knew that was coming. I mean, I could just tell as he was building to it.
I made them call me Billy Crystal, or I would not perform my magic.
It would have been better if you had called yourself Dr. Billy Crystal. That would have been even more appropriate, I think.
Okay, well, I'll go back in time 15 years and change that.
Get on it, man. You can make clouds. You should be able to make time machines. All right. So look, I know you didn't want to talk a lot about this, but it's the first question that comes to my mind as the layman. How well does this work? What data, such as it is, are the Chinese looking at and going, this is a good temporary fix for our problems? What's going on there, do you think?
For the most part, it's not great. It works sometimes.
It's in the Hail Mary range?
Between the Hail Mary and the Hail Beatrice range. But, they're pretty desperate out there, so they're trying it. But what's interesting about it is the chemical they use, and it's not something you would just pluck out of thin air. It's used for a particular reason, and it's called silver iodide. How many times have you heard that in your lives? None? That was a question, gentlemen.
I've got a bottle of it on my shelf. I'm looking at it right now.
Good. Enjoy. So there are 10 million organic chemicals that are crystalline, and maybe you could seed your cloud with that. But silver iodide is used for two reasons, and it's kind of interesting. One is, let's say you threw sodium chloride crystals into the cloud. They'll dissolve, and you'll have a little bit of salt in your cloud. You'll do nothing. But silver iodide, for reasons which I will only go into if you beg me, is one of the most insoluble or inorganic salts of all. Just to put that in perspective, I looked up sodium iodide, which a liter of water will dissolve 4 pounds of sodium iodide. So that's very soluble. But if you go to silver iodide, it is 614 million times less soluble. So to dissolve the 4 pounds, you'd need 24 Olympic-sized swimming pools, depending on how much urine is in them. I think that probably has some effect. So don't tell me you haven't peed in a pool.
Never. I'm a good Christian. I don't pee in pools. Of course, Josh, everyone at some point in their lives has failed to consider the well-being of others and peed in a pool, I think.
Well, I think we want to keep this short today, but I actually did write a piece on analyzing pools for pee. Maybe we could talk about that some other time. The bottom line is every single pool ever measured has urine in it. Have a nice swim.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Anyways, clouds.
Yeah. So getting back to silver iodide, first of all, it's incredibly insoluble. So it's not going to dissolve. If it does anything at all, it'll start the process of crystallization on the little tiny crystals of silver iodide, and hopefully that'll catalyze the formation of more ice, which will then turn to water on its way down, and you'll have rain, if you're lucky. The other thing that's neat about it is if you look at the structure of the crystal lattice of ice and silver iodide, they're really kind of similar looking. And that's not a coincidence either, because if you want to seed something and a solution and cause it to crystallize, the best way to do it is to just chuck a seed crystal of the same substance in there, and then it works like gangbusters. Now, obviously, you're not going to throw ice into a cloud and expect it to do anything, although they do use dry ice. But the crystal structure of the two is similar enough that water kind of recognizes the structure of silver iodide and says, hey, that's some ice. Let's just go hang out on that and we'll turn to ice also. A little oversimplified, but not by that much. So if you can't seed something with the exact right chemical, if you do so with a very similar structural chemical, it can sometimes fool the system into crystallizing. And then once it starts, you get a little bit of ice, and then that becomes exponential seed crystal. So it's just a matter of getting it going. So the other good thing about it is you don't need a lot of it. And so it falls to the ground, and it's so insoluble that it just sits there. Doesn't dissolve, doesn't go into the groundwater. So, for those reasons, it's a pretty clever choice for getting water out of a cloud, to whatever extent that works.
Well, I'm really curious to see how this works. So maybe you can write a follow-up piece if you find any new information, because I've heard these sort of schemes, discussed before. Like there's been different proposals to, shoot some sort of aerosol into the atmosphere to deflect sunlight and reduce climate change, that sort of thing. But I don't think that's never really been done, and there's a lot of dispute over whether or not that would be effective and whether it could backfire in some serious way. So maybe you can follow up and write another story about this, Josh.
I might, or I might not.
Nobody tells me what to write.
No. What you can say for this is it's harmless. So it's not like you're trying to alter the climate. You're trying to bring a little more water in a microenvironment, and it's not great anyhow. So it's really the chemistry of why that chemical was chosen that's of the particular interest.
Well, like Chuck said, sounds like a Hail Mary is a pretty good way to describe this. Because what the hell? It can't hurt. So so we'll give it a shot.
There's a pun in there. Did you happen to catch yourself?
I did. I was going to let it go because trying to be a little more sophisticated, but I apparently...
Come on, you said that on purpose? No way.
No, as soon as you said it, I'll be honest here. As soon as you said it, I went, hail, ha ha ha.
Chuck's sitting there going, I don't get it.
This is quickly devolving into a morning radio show. All we need now is the fart noises on the soundboard. And
where's Howard Stern when you need him?
Yeah.
All right, I'll shut up for a while.
All right, Chuck. So let's talk about sugar taxes. As I said, people either hate these or they love these. I think among a lot of people in public health and nutrition, there's sort of like a faith-based statement.
Oh, absolutely.
In the name of the sugar tax, we will reduce soda consumption.
Exactly.
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So tell us about this article you wrote.
So this is an article by people that don't have the wherewithal to actually do a primary study. It's another meta-analysis, which is very popular, but I'm afraid that the more meta-analysis we do, the less primary data we collect, and after a while there'll just be nothing to do a meta-analysis on. In any case, they went back, they looked at all these articles that they could find on the sugar taxes. And they found 400 plus articles that they thought were useful in their consideration. But here's the interesting thing. The bulk of them reflect information from Philadelphia, Mexico, or Berkeley. So we don't have a lot of variety. These guys keep mining the same tax data over and over again. So I suppose, I guess if you keep repeating it long enough, people will be more content that it's correct. And they have proven, once again, a lot of basic concepts in economics. If you raise the price of something, people will consume less of it unless they really, 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 really want it. And the tax has done nothing more than raise the price of the sugary beverages. And as a result, people have made substitutions. And among the things that they've done to substitute is they'll drive a few blocks away to an area that's not taxed and buy there. Or they will switch to another fluid that's as bad or worse than the ones that they were already drinking, thinking fruit juice is going to be better, but in terms of sugar content, it's actually worse than some of the sugary beverages out there. So once again, all we can really say, there is no data at all to show that these taxes has made any impact on our health. There's a lot of data to show that it has an impact on what we purchase. But that isn't the point of doing them. And to get to your point about it being faith-based, that's one of the quotes that I put in there. And they said prior studies of BMI and sugary beverage taxes were limited to research on low state sales tax, which are unlikely to adequately represent potential changes in BMI outcomes. So the problem is not their idea that taxing will change our habits enough that will improve our health. It's that they haven't taxed us enough. And so that's the faith part. And you have to ask yourself, how often and how long are they going to do this for before they decide that this is not the best approach to nudging our eating habits in a more nutritional direction. Once again, it's another example of a sin tax like that on alcohol, like that on cigarettes, that tends to be regressive, penalizing people that have the least amount of income to pay the taxes, and where it becomes very unclear where these additional revenues go, except into the general fund, so they can be used for whatever they'd like.
Yeah, into the slush fund, so they can, I don't know,
buy a slushie.
There you go. See, there's a good pun. I like that one.
Yes, that's not bad.
Yeah. Were you going to add something, Josh?
Yeah, I'm wondering, well, for a couple of thoughts. First of all, in a way, this is sort of like the mislabeled opioid crisis that I write about a lot, in that it's a simple, maybe even simpleton solution to a complex problem, one that sounds good but can't possibly work. And the cynical side of me says that nobody really cares whether people consume less sugar or not. I think it's just a way to squeeze more money out of people, just like the lottery is and all the other regressive taxes. I don't know, Chuck, what do you think about that?
I think there's definitely a group of people that feel that way. The nice thing about this is it comes with a nutritional halo that we can claim that we're doing it to improve population health. And that becomes a more difficult argument with some of the other sin taxes that are out there. But I given the results, given that we've shown no change in people's weight or health, I don't understand why they persevere other than it brings income into the government. Now, some people will argue, and there's certainly a point to be made, that it takes several years before you might see a change in health outcome. But even the few studies that are around that look at calorie intake or weight have shown no significant changes within a year or two of instituting them. So I would agree with you. I think it's an overly simplified, easy answer that brings money into the government coffers, and then they can cover it with this halo of we're just helping you out.
There's some fascinating psychology at work here, Chuck, and I think it reveals itself in the way that people present their data or the way that they interpret their results. And it reminds me, as we've talked about before, the work of the economist Thomas Sowell, and he's written several books specifically about this. One of them was Visions of the Anointed. The other one is Intellectuals and Society. And in there, he sort of talks about the struggle that a lot of academics, a lot of policymakers have, where they have assumptions that they go into their work with, and they just cannot contradict those. So, excuse me, the example you just gave at the end of the study, they said, well, the taxes aren't working thus far. We just need to make them bigger. And I've seen the same thing with other interventions, like we're going to take vending machines out of schools, and we're going to make sure there's potable water in more places in urban environments, like all of these goofy things. It's like the problem is not that people don't have access to water. The problem is that soda is delicious and they want to drink that instead of water. You know, it's not that it's hard to exercise. It's that they don't want to. And I think we just, I don't know if it's just a human tendency, but we just struggle to recognize things that are right in front of us when we don't want to. So I'm curious your thoughts on this, especially as a physician. You must have some insight into this.
No, I don't know about that. I'm an eater before I'm a physician. But, I think you're correct. People kind of do the things that they want, and we can try and nudge them. But oftentimes what we think are nudges are not. I think we talked the other day about the fact that when they looked at putting up calorie counts in the fast food places, the people that ate salads wind up eating more calories because they were rewarding themselves for having the low-cal salad. So they made it up with the supersized French fries or something else along the way. So there's, human behavior is very difficult to predict. There was a series of podcasts by Freakonomics talking about the difficulty of bringing scientific ideas into policy. And I think that this is a good example of that problem. There's a lot of sense that comes from saying if we take in less sugar, our weight will go down. But they've never been, done any kind of testing other than in Mexico or Berkeley or Philadelphia as a real world test. They've never worked out the kinks in that and dealt with all the problems along the way. So they wind up with a half-baked policy position, which they now are backed into a corner with because they're getting funding for it or because they have papers in that area, and they just stick with it. It's crazy.
It's challenging, and it's not an easy issue, right? I don't think anybody here, really anybody in the world, has the insight to know how to make, 40% of the population lose 20 pounds. There's just so many variables in each individual circumstance, and it's just hard. But I think that's another thing is, especially with people that work in the policy world or they work in public health, their job is to fix things. And so when they can't fix things, I could understand why they would have trouble acknowledging that and just saying, well, we don't know what to do. Let's go work on something else, because there's just so many things in play. And just for example, we have subsidies that artificially decrease the price of the primary sugar in soda.
Yeah.
So and don't get me wrong, cheap food is very, very good. I'm not critiquing the fact that people have access to food. That's one of the things that makes civilization thrive, really. But I've heard some people, in public health and in economics, they'll say things like, well, we subsidize the production of high fructose corn syrup, so we should tax soda on the other end. And it's just, it's just so nonsensical, right? Because it's like, instead of putting two policies in place, just get rid of the bad one.
It's interesting because I thought about that and I forgot to mention it. That to me seemed to be if you're looking for low-hanging fruit, let's stop subsidizing sugar. Now, that's a big business in Florida. That's a huge business in Florida, and I will not get elected to any office now that quote is out there. But if we were to reduce the subsidies the federal government give to growing sugar, the price of sugar will rise. And we will see all the benefits across the board in terms of that. Now, that's just not a politically viable position to take, because they're dealing with very large businesses that have very large lobbying efforts. And it's far easier to go tax some schmuck that went to the Wawa to get a soda than it is to get at that core problem.
I like that quote. A Wawa schmuck.
It is a good point though, Chuck. And maybe this is more of an economic story than it is anything else, because the point you're getting at is that you have this very tight organized lobby. Of course, you have the food companies that benefit from the subsidies. You have the agricultural industry, which I know a lot about, and I write a lot about it, and I have a lot of respect for those people. But it is funny how they will say, we don't want the government over-regulating pesticides, and we don't want them telling farmers they can't grow GMOs. But then when it comes to, their special little belief here, they're like, whoa, that's money you're going to take away from us, Yes. So you have this very organized lobby that knows what it's doing. And then you have the average guy who has no political power. I mean, he has one vote, but, let's get real here. And so it's easy, as you said, to put something like this in place and, get in front of the cameras and say, we're tackling the obesity epidemic, and then nothing really changes. And here we are still, there's no great answer, I suppose.
No. Not that I can see at the moment.
Chuck, helpfully summing up the issue. And I think we'll just move on from there. But good story. I really recommend everybody read this, because we didn't talk too much about it, but you did a good analysis of this different research. And the point about, we're just doing meta-analysis on top of meta-analysis. I'm starting to see now in the literature reviews of reviews. And,
it's very inexpensive research to do. You don't have to go before an institutional review board, because the only thing being harmed are the papers themselves, not individuals. And, and by the way you choose the studies, you can report anything you'd like.
This is true. This is the math magic concept that you've discussed before. But it's good for people to be aware of it, because people either outright reject mainstream scientific research or they just endorse it wholeheartedly. And I think we need a middle ground. You need to understand the concepts and then approach it with a little bit of skepticism so you can see stuff like this. But we actually have another great example, I think, of these sort of fallacies that are prevalent in scientific research. In this article I wrote, which was very subtly titled "Heart-Stopping Stupidity: Climate Change Isn't Increasing Heart Attacks." And there was so much here that we could really get into. But what I found fascinating as I got past the headlines and I started looking at some of the literature, these people, most of them work, they're cardiologists, or they have some background in environmental science. So they're trying to, combine these two fields of work. And when you do that, you really have to start getting out the thumbtacks and the red string, and you have to connect this event to this event, and then there's this event. It's really strange. So they'll say, well, heat waves in California exacerbate wildfires, and therefore in this region, wildfires elevate the risk of a heart attack. But in this other region, it gets really, really cold, and then old people who are more prone to heart disease can't really tolerate the cold, and they're even more sick because they have heart disease. Therefore, so in other words, all I'm getting at is you have all of these different variables, and you just sort of pick and choose the ones that help you make your case. And if there's data that doesn't support it, and there is plenty of it, as we'll discuss, then you just ignore that. And then you have outlets like ABC, who I was highlighting in the story. They just run with it because it's a scary story. Everyone knows if it bleeds, it leads, blah, 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 blah. but there's a narrative to sell. Everybody, and I don't mean that cynically. I mean, everyone's trying to tell a story, no matter where they're coming from. And this is a great one. If you can say, climate change is real, it's going to be really bad. In fact, it's going to be so bad, Grandpa Fred might drop dead from a heart attack. So, so it draws attention. But I'm curious to get both of your guys' thoughts on this. When you read a story like this, what occurs to you?
Well, I always find that there's a shifting goals. They'll talk either about heart disease, in which case they add in, or they talk about cardiovascular disease, which includes heart disease and stroke, any cause of disease from atherosclerosis, versus talking about heart attacks per se. Because oftentimes the data on heart attacks doesn't look that sexy until you lump it in with a few other problems, and then boom, you get a big number that you can really talk about. So that's always one of the problems in there. And one of the problems in this is when they talked about they talked about heat stroke. Oh God, it's a stroke. So that's a cardiovascular disease, except heat stroke in terms of being a medical problem is really called hyperthermia. It's just a problem with your temperature. It has nothing to do with the idea that you have an ischemic event in your brain and you wind up with a neurologic problem, unable to work part of your body. So right away they confabulate things there. So once again, if you're going to read the literature, it's always nice to actually have a background in the material that they're talking about. The other thing that I think has been true with a lot of this stuff is that scientists have the requirement to fund their work, and the way they get their work funded is by topics that are of current popular interest. So tying your heart disease statistics to climate change, that opens up a whole new area of funding for people. So it's not surprising, especially in the summer months, where you're going to see more articles along that line. The same thing, and this is equally true, the number of articles that I've seen in the last year on disparities in care have been huge. And the disparities of care are there. The disparities of care have been there for a long time, but nearly every article will reference back to that because that's a way of virtual signaling to the community, and it's more importantly a means of expressing to the funding agencies that you're on board and you're going to be looking at how these two issues intertwine.
Yeah, I think it's this is similar to the chemical scare industry and the anti-opioid industry. These are funding and money driven primarily, if not entirely. If you want to write an article about climate change and the composition of tuna farts, it'll probably get funded. And academics know this. And in a way, the funding is really taking away from the science, which is the opposite of what you would hope, because to get funded, you have to be on board with a hot topic, one that's controversial, and one where you're taking the side that is favored by other academics. So I think this kills science, actually, the way that it's funded, because you're seeing garbage about chemicals and alternative medicine and sugar taxes and all this other stuff, which is, let me just call it quasi-intentional garbage, so that the academic can get funded and doesn't rock the boat and everybody's happy. So It's like an intellectual corruption almost.
It's a good point, and I've heard several scientists try to defend the way the funding system works because it's their career. So I understand, right? The incentive for them is to say, no, I'm doing good work. This is supposed to work this way. But the way that they do it is they'll say you have institutions like the NIH, which primarily exist to fund academic research. Then you have academic researchers who exist to do that research. And so you have these sorts of studies and the sort of meta-analyses we've been talking about. They're very low risk. They're not very expensive, as Chuck was talking about, because the data's all there. You just basically have to aggregate it and then run whatever statistical model you're going to run. And you can relate it to a topic that's in the news also, as Chuck mentioned. So the incentives work for everybody involved, but as Josh just mentioned, you're not actually discovering new knowledge. You're not advancing our understanding of the world or of public health or whatever. And this goes on and on. And let me get a little more specific here, because I think you start to see really obvious gaps in these arguments and in these analyses. And I was able to find a 2007 review of heart disease in the developed world. And these researchers pointed out, and interestingly, because climate change was not part of the context, they were saying, this is great. We're reducing heart disease all over the world. Healthcare is getting better. We have access to drugs. We're reducing risk factors like high cholesterol, this and that. So they're praising the developed world for basically not eliminating is the wrong word, because heart disease is still a really big problem, but we're getting much better at treating it and preventing it. And of course, heart disease is the main thing that's going to increase your risk of a heart attack. So in other words, the data are out there that really clearly illustrate that this association is mostly nonsense. But it's just overlooked. And I just find that fascinating that this is allowed to go on.
You got to keep in mind that there's another player in this that we haven't mentioned, and that's the journals themselves. Because when you've got a pay-to-print journal, there's another money incentive there. So there's another reason to that you can get garbage out there and use it to further your academic career or your cause, because you can get anything published if you just look under enough rocks.
I think one of the things Cameron's talked about several times is the politicization of the journals, that the journals are taking public health positions about things, and that begins to influence their editorial choices, which goes along with what Josh has been talking about. All of this leads to the point where you don't get as much diversity of thought as you might, because all the reward, financial or tenure or whatever that they might be, are lockstep moving towards a set of specific narratives, because those people that have been working in the narratives for years are now in position to do the funding. Because who are the advisors to the NIH about how the money is to be passed out, but the acknowledged experts that are in the field that they've been funding forever and a day.
How would you change that?
Well, I'm a big fan of open access. I don't understand what the publishing community, what the value added is any longer to the publishing community. When I started in practice and the journal came every month, there was some value there, because they have to set the type, they have to do all the pictures and all the rest. But today, that can be done very quickly on a home computer with a page printing program. So that cost of theirs has dropped down to essentially nothing. So the papers come in, they have volunteers who read the papers. The publishing companies are not spending any significant amount of money in terms of doing this. So why aren't all these journals free? The margins, the last time I looked for medical journals, is something in the range of 20% It's huge. And they charge all of the institutions, they charge all the university libraries to have access to this stuff. They charge them millions of dollars. Now, some of the universities are starting to fight back. And finally, the federal government is saying that if it's research that we fund, it has to be open access. You want to get paid by the government to do some research, then the results of that research have to be available outside of a paywall. And I think that that's a step in the right direction.
That would certainly help, I think. One other thing, and this will never happen. I just don't see it happening. But it would be good if you had some of these scientific institutions come out and just say, we have a particular agenda. We have a particular perspective. That said, we will argue with you. If you disagree with the study we've published, we will publish your letter to the editor, or we will give you a spot to respond to the study, or we'll publish your data. But I don't see that happening. What I see, and you know, what Chuck mentioned is like you have certain journals, like Science is a pretty prominent one. They have an editor there who every month or so publishes an op-ed, and it's just right along with whatever the current political climate is. But the way he frames it is, you know, science tells us that we need to do X, and science tells us we need to do Y. And it just poisons the dialogue, because the implication is that the only one who disagrees with me is anti-science, and that's just a stupid way to frame the issue. But more importantly, it's just not, you're not getting anywhere. It's just political point scoring, and it doesn't help. So if they could just come out and say, yeah, we're going to be honest about what we're doing here, let's talk about it, that'd be fine. But I just don't see that happening.
There's one other sleazy aspect you can throw in there, and that's the old boys club of reviewing, because you know, they're especially in specific fields. Everybody knows everybody, and if you end up giving somebody a hard time, they're going to give you a hard time back. So it's a scratch your back type of thing. I think that also feeds into this.
Yes, there's you know, science remains a human endeavor, and it has all the problems that any of the human endeavors have, including cliques and grudges and favoritism and all the rest. Just what it is. It's a human enterprise.
Very good points all around. I think this has been a fruitful discussion. And I think the takeaway is, as always, is you just have to approach this stuff critically. You just have to assume, maybe assume is the wrong word. You just have to be prepared that there's going to be some serious gap somewhere in what you're reading, whether it's a news report or a study or whatever it is. And maybe that's the way over time things change, is people just get better at consuming information, and then that influences policy. It makes the world a better place. I don't know, guys. I don't have any answers. It's 111 degrees. I got nothing.
Okay. Well, at least you didn't have a heart attack.
But you might.
That would be a bit of irony, wouldn't it? After just ranting about why that's a silly association, if I just keeled over and died. Okay. It's not going to happen because I'm in good health, which is nice. I like being in good health. All right, we're gonna land the plane. Thank you as always for joining us. If you want to get these stories we talk about, you just go to our website, acsh.org, and then there's a little tab up there. It says subscribe. Click on that. Punch in your email. 3 times a week, we'll send you these stories, and the ones that you all read the most are the ones that we talk about on this podcast. So, as always, thank you. Follow us on Twitter. It's at ACSH.org. And Josh has got a pretty active Twitter. It's just Josh Bloom ACSH, I think, right?
Yeah, at Josh Bloom ACSH. I don't even know how I thought of that. It's just that clever. You're
a poet, absolutely. And I think, Chuck, you're like me, and you're not a big fan of the social medias. So
No.
No Twitter handles for us. You just got to follow Josh and follow the organization. All right. We will see you guys next week.
Take care.